The Battle of the Seven Teeth. The mist hung over the vast battlefield like a veil of mystery, hiding both the contours of the land and the fate of the warriors who defended it. On one side, the invading forces, arrayed in intimidating ranks, carried weapons forged in distant lands. On the other, the Vikings, men and women of unshakable courage, raised their shields, forming an impenetrable wall that seemed to be an extension of the very land they defended. With each step the invaders advanced, the Vikings' resistance grew fiercer, as if each blow of their blades were a declaration that they would not yield. The disputed land was an unknown even to its defenders, a land of dense forests and treacherous mountains. It seemed alive, conspiring alongside the Vikings. During the fighting, tales emerged of warriors who swore they heard whispers in the wind, invisible guides that led them to high, protected ground. It was as if nature itself had recognized its rightful guardians. To the invaders, the landscape was a treacherous maze. To the Vikings, it was a strategic ally. At the height of the battle, when victory seemed to be in the enemy's favor, the defenders sprang an ambush worthy of the sagas. Using their intimate knowledge of the land, they lured their enemies into a narrow valley, where arrows rained down like a storm and hand-to-hand attacks were relentless. The triumph was not just a military victory, it was a reaffirmation of the Vikings' bond with this mysterious land. And so the song of victory echoed across the mountains, promising that this would be just the first of many stories to be written about the mastery of this unknown territory. Harald, the Shield of Dawn, peered into the distance with keen eyes, as if he could see beyond the mist that hid the enemy army. With hair as golden as the sun and a presence that made even the most fearless warrior feel protected, Harald was more than a leader. He was the embodiment of the Viking spirit. On the other side marched Alric of Ardennes, the stern commander of the Christian forces, a man whose unwavering faith was matched only by his ambition. Alric was known as the Flame of the Cross, a title that both inspired his men and terrified his enemies. The battle that would rage for 7 days has been etched in history as the War of the Seven Teeth, in reference to the jagged cliffs that surrounded the battlefield. Harald knew that he could not rely on brute force alone. Using his knowledge of the unknown land, he divided his forces into small groups, assigned to night ambushes and silent sabotage. Meanwhile, Alric, with his impeccable organization, built fortified camps and used battering rams to try to break through the natural obstacles that blocked his advance. On the second day, Harald's cunning began to shine. He ordered his warriors to camouflage themselves with the local moss and foliage, blending into the landscape. During the night, they infiltrated Alric's camp, setting fire to supplies and spreading chaos among the Christian soldiers. In response, Alric, with calculated coolness, adapted his tactics, sending scouts to study the terrain and predict Viking movements. Both leaders played like masters on the board of war. But the real question was, who controlled the board? The land seemed to have chosen a side, but its loyalty remained a mystery. Harald was not just a warrior. He was a symbol of hope for his people. Born in a small village on the edge of a fjord, he grew up listening to his grandmother's stories of ancient gods and legendary heroes. As a young man, he led his first raid, surprising even the most seasoned warriors with his skill in reading the terrain and his quick decisions. But Harald was not driven solely by the glory of battle. For him, each conquest was a promise of a better future for his tribe, more land to cultivate, more resources to sustain future generations. Despite his unwavering strength, he carried the pain of loss. His youngest sister had been kidnapped and taken as a slave in a Christian raid years earlier, an event that fueled his distrust and fury toward the invaders. Alric of Ardennes, on the other hand, was the son of nobility from a distant land, but his path had never been easy. Raised in a monastery after the untimely death of his parents, He learned early on that discipline and faith could conquer the impossible. He was charismatic and methodical, a man who knew how to use both words and swords to shape destiny. Although he proclaimed that his mission was to spread the light of the cross, Ulrich was also an ambitious strategist, who saw in the conquest of this unknown land a chance to solidify his name in history. Deep inside, however, there was a man haunted by doubts. He knew that his soldiers followed him out of necessity, not loyalty, and he feared that the slightest slip-up could compromise his leadership. Both leaders were mirrors of their people, but they also had their own internal conflicts. Harald, though beloved by his warriors, faced the constant pressure to lead not only with strength but with wisdom, knowing that one mistake could mean the end of his people. Ulrich, even as he carried the standard of the cross, questioned whether his faith was being used as a weapon or a shield. In every decision they made, not only the fate of the battle was at stake, but also the legacy they would leave behind. And the land, silent witness to their actions, seemed to watch and wait for who would be worthy of its rule. The unknown land, which the Vikings called Fjordum, was a place of extremes. Colossal mountains stood like sentinels to the north, winding valleys covered in dense vegetation, and at the heart of the land, a vast lake with waters so dark that it seemed to hold ancient secrets. For the Vikings, Fjordum was not just a territory to be defended. It was a promise of prosperity, a land where their children could grow up free under the open sky. For Ulrich's Christians, however, Fjordum was a strategic region, an essential piece in the chessboard of their conquests. On the third day of the War of the Seven Teeth, the battle reached a level of brutality that would echo in stories for generations. Harald, taking advantage of his knowledge of the jagged cliffs that gave the battle its name, positioned his archers on high points, ensuring a wide view of the valley. At the same time, groups of warriors armed with axes waited hidden among the trees. When Ulrich sent the first wave of troops across the valley, believing it to be safe, he was met by a hail of arrows that turned the advance into chaos. Even so, the Christians did not retreat. Ulrich personally led the second charge, using shields to protect his men as they pressed the defenders. The battle seemed evenly matched until the fifth day, when Harald made a move that would change the course of the fighting. During the night, he sent a group of scouts to divert the course of a river that ran through the territory. When morning came, the invaders found their supplies buried in mud, unable to move chariots or artillery. Ulrich, sensing the blow, adjusted his strategy, ordering his men to build makeshift bridges and burn down parts of the forest to clear the way. However, the land seemed to conspire against him. The fog, which thickened as the afternoon wore on, made communication difficult among his troops, while the Vikings used the confusion to attack in quick, devastating waves. By dawn on the sixth day, Fjordum seemed a living land, breathing with the conflict that consumed it. The air was thick with the smell of burning wood and iron, while the sound of shouts and the rumbling of drums echoed off the jagged cliffs. Harald gathered his warriors in a circle near the great lake, where the dark waters reflected the glow of torches. "Today, we fight not only for Fjordum," he declared, his voice as steady as ice. "We fight for our children, our stories, and our gods. This land has chosen us, and it will not be taken." His men responded with a roar that seemed to shake the earth itself. Meanwhile, in the Christian camp, Ulrich of Ardennes reviewed his troops. Exhaustion was evident on the faces of his men, but he knew that retreat was not an option. "Victory does not belong to those who fear the darkness," he said, holding up the standard bearing the cross. "It belongs to those who walk through it with courage and faith." He divided his forces into three groups, betting on a three-pronged offensive, a direct advance through the central valley, a foray into the forest to the south, and a bold attempt to cross the lake using improvised rafts. The strategy was risky, but Alric knew he had no time to waste. The confrontation began at noon, with the pale sun barely breaking through the mist. The Christian troops advancing through the valley were met by an avalanche of rocks, carefully prepared by the Vikings during the night. The cliffs that protected them became veritable weapons, and the invaders were forced to retreat, leaving the terrain littered with broken shields and cries of pain. To the south, in the forest, the advance looked more promising. But when Alric's troops began to cut down trees to clear a path, they discovered too late that they had walked into a trap. Harald had hidden warriors in the treetops, who descended like shadows, attacking with axes and spears. The most dramatic clash, however, occurred at the lake. Alric's rafts began to cross the water under the cover of mist, while the Vikings watched in silence. As the first Christian boats reached the center of the lake, Harald gave the signal. Small Viking boats, hidden among the banks, suddenly emerged, like awakened sea serpents. Armed with harpoons and torches, the Vikings attacked the rafts, setting them ablaze and sinking them one by one. The dark waters became a graveyard as Alric's soldiers struggled to swim to shore under the weight of their armor. The day ended with both sides exhausted, but morale clearly in the Vikings' favor. They had repelled each attack, using the terrain, cunning, and ferocity that defined them. As Harald prepared for another night of vigil, he knew that Alric was not a man to give up easily. On the horizon, Christian torches shone like watchful eyes, a silent promise that the seventh day would be the bloodiest of all. The seventh day dawned like any other, but the air was different. The fog, thick and oppressive, seemed to envelop every corner of Fjordum, as if the land itself was silent, awaiting the inevitable. The coming fight would not be like the previous ones, everyone knew that. Both Harald and Alric, on their battlefields, prepared their forces for the night to come. It would no longer be a battle of strategy or attrition. The final fight, the last dance between steel and courage, would be decided by a single factor: the brute force of will. The sun set slowly, dyeing the horizon a red color like blood already spilled. In the ranks of the Vikings, many looked to the heavens, as if waiting for something. And then, as if on cue, a cold breeze swept across the field, carrying the sound of distant thunder. It was as if the ancient gods were preparing to give their blessing. Harald, his eyes fixed on the stars rising in the night sky, whispered to his men, "Today, the sun does not set for us. We will fight alongside our ancestors." On the Christian side, Alric was far from the invincible man he had been in the early days. His eyes were weary, his soul scarred by loss and suffering. He knew that as the night wore on, there would be no more room for retreat or strategy. He had staked everything on this last offensive, and now only the strongest would prevail. In his mind, he prayed for strength, but something in his heart knew that it would not be faith that would bring him victory. It would be the strength of his troops. As the moon rose, illuminating the battle lines, Harald gave the signal. With a primal roar, the Vikings advanced with a ferocity that seemed to have been awakened by the gods themselves. The night would be swift, like a storm, without mercy or hesitation. The Christians, taken by surprise by the speed of the attack, tried to organize themselves, but the Vikings were like a wave that swept everything before them. The blades cut through the air. The sound of metal against metal was deafening, and the ground was covered in fallen bodies, victims of a brutal clash. The final battle lasted no more than an hour, but it was a sea of blood. When the last blow was struck, the earth seemed to breathe again, and the silence that followed was deeper than anyone could have imagined. The Vikings, exhausted but victorious, raised their weapons to the sky, thanking the gods and the earth for their victory. The land that had been conquered with so much sacrifice was now theirs, and peace, at least for the time being, would reign over Fjordum. Alric, however, lay on the ground, his strength fading. In the end, it was the strength of the earth and the ancient gods that would guarantee the victory of the Viking people, and not the faith of a man who had failed to understand the true power of nature. The Battle of the Seven Teeth, as it became known, was recorded in the Viking sagas as a triumph that would echo for centuries. Fjordum, now under Norse rule, would become a symbol of resilience and courage, a reminder that when united, the Vikings were unbeatable. Alric's Christians, defeated but not exterminated, retreated to their homelands, vowing to return someday. But with Harald's victory, the promise of a new future became more concrete with each passing day. With the battle won, Harald looked around at the men around him, weary but with hearts aflame. Fjordum was now an extension of his strength and will. The gods, as promised, had granted their blessing, but the true victory had come from the immeasurable courage of his warriors. Harald knew that this battle was only the beginning of a new chapter for the Vikings. But for him, what truly mattered at that moment was the land that now belonged to his people. The echo of the victorious shouts was lost in the mountains, while the first rays of sunlight illuminated the hills of Fjordum, marking the beginning of a new era. Harald, immortalized in the memory of his land and people, prepared for more adventures. Fjordum was safe, but the future still held mysteries that he and his warriors would need to unravel. The history of his people would continue to be written, but for now, he looked to the horizon, knowing that true power lay in the strength of spirit and the unity of his people. Did you like this story? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next epic sagas. The journey continues.